let's start off with that film. It gets a lovely mention in this book. Um, I mentioned that it was shot in Wales, not in Yorkshire.
Yes.
It was the first day of the shoot, and then something happened.
Well, it was the first day of the shoot of my first movie as a co-star. We're about to start the first take, uh, which was David and I getting in the back with the sheep. And I just got hit with the nerves, and I go, John Landis, I just got to take a leak. I got to go really bad. And you go, okay, fine, go to the trailer. And there were these little gypsy caravan kind of trailers. So I go in there, I start to pee, and then the trailer starts to move, and I see it's hitched to a pickup truck, and the pickup truck is heading back to London, and I'm banging on the thing, and 15 minutes go by, and they're going, "Where the hell did Griffin go?" And I was helpless to go, and we drove for like 45 minutes, and finally they figured out what happened, and they intersected before it got on the main highway to London. They intercepted me and brought me back, but that was like 2 hours later. And John said, we haven't even started shooting, and you've already put us behind schedule.
Obviously, the film was a success at the time, but have you been surprised, not just by the longevity of this film, but by the sheer size of its following and this devoted audience?
Well, actually, it wasn't a success at the time. It was expected to be a huge success. John's previous film was Animal House, which was a huge box office success, and the log line for American Werewolf was from the director of Animal House, a different kind of animal. But when the movie came out, critics really were offended that we dared combine humor and horror in the same genre. 2 years later, Ghostbusters comes out, and they go, "Isn't it brilliant how they combined humor and horror?" But it was a little ahead of its time. But over the years, particularly with DVDs and cable television, more and more people saw it, and it's huge. People come up to me all the time. That I saw this movie when I was 8 years old. It just traumatized me for life, and it's really endured, which is kind of great because it's there's no CGI in it. There's no it was made pretty simply, but it just overrode the popularity. The technology was. It's a very popular movie.
I also think it's quite interesting for British audiences to see a film in which the first two characters we see are American, then the central character is American, and it's an American director, but it's quite a perceptive view of Britishness.
Yeah, I think John had been working in Europe as a PA. He was started in Kelly's Heroes, and he spent a lot of time in England, as a PA on various British movies. So he'd spent some time here. He wrote this. He started as a PA when he was 18 years old, and he started the script when he was 19 years old.
Yeah.
It's something he's always had in his drawer, just dying to make.
So something about your role, and again, for people who haven't seen it, I don't want to say too much, but you sort of embody a strange kind of Greek chorus, let's say, in the film. And it's not just that your character is humorous, but looking across many of the roles that you've played over your career, and we're going to see some of them this evening, there's a strain of dark humor that you seem to embrace and relish. And I was just wondering, is that something that you discovered very, very early? And did it just develop naturally?
It's something I was raised on, a diet of very dark humor. My father, Irish Catholic family, they had a terrifically dark sense of humor. And so I've always had a certain kind of a wryness, observation, an observation for the absurd, and able to, kind of comment on it and build on it. And it served me well, as an actor. When I met John for this movie, I really hadn't done anything. And I went to a typical audition. I'm in a room with other actors. We're waiting to meet the director, and I'm expecting to have to read, which I was terrible at for auditions. I'm dyslexic. And I went in to meet John, and we talked for about 10 to 15 minutes. And maybe I made a joke or two or whatever, but I don't remember. And he never brought out a script to read. He just asked, "Are you claustrophobic?" So I assumed it was a movie about a guy in an elevator or something. And I got to my apartment, and the phone rang, and John said, "I'm going to send a guy. There'll be a guy in your hallway in about 15 minutes. He's going to hand you a script. I want you to read it and then hand the script back and tell me if you want to play the part of Jack." And I read the script, and it was a great part. And he talked like me, and he had my kind of sensibility. And but I don't. I guess he saw something, my sense of humor or something, because he, I think he was looking for a guy who could look grotesque and torn up, but still make jokes, and talk in this like everything's fine.
So this element of humor and as we see, performative humor taps into something that very early in the book you talk about when the first word that you spoke was taxi. That they're giving this sense that you're going somewhere. With that idea, how I know that you, and we'll discuss a little more shortly about your life in Hollywood and Beverly Hills, the people you encountered. But aside of looking on at that world, how early did you think inside you, yeah, this isn't just something that exists over there. This is a world that I actually want to play an active role in?
It took me quite a while, actually. I grew up. I grew up in Hollywood. My father was a television producer who was a very social person. And particularly in those days, television society and movie society did not overlap. But he gave parties with, that were, and our guests in our homes were like Billy Wilder and David Niven and a young Warren Beatty and Dennis Hopper and all these like incredible people. I was really too young to know much about them. They were just sort of loud, drunk adults, and but I and my father was a work in progress, and he was very at that time in his life very, very superficial and about surrounding himself. He gauged his worth, his self-worth on the celebrities that came to his home and the parties that he was invited to. And something about me as a kid equated that with Hollywood and a certain phoniness. And I really wanted to move to New York at a very early age. And at that time, I thought I'd be a writer. Like my aunt and uncle were journalists, Joan Didion and John Gregory Dunne, and there was new journalism was being happened with Tom Wolfe and Hunter Thompson. So I was resisting acting, showbiz, all that stuff. But I was in high school, and the drama head of the drama department kind of bullied me into auditioning for a play called Zoo Story by Edward Albee. And as soon as I did that play, I was like a goner. I mean, yes, I'm going to be an actor. I'm still going to New York, but I'm going to, and I'm not going to do the Hollywood TV bullshit. I'm going to be a serious New York actor and be on the stage. Now I make movies in Hollywood, and I'm doing the serious Hollywood bullshit. But at the time, I was the last thing I wanted to be was in show business.
It made me laugh when I read the Zoo Story piece in the book, because I did drama at A-level, the sort of final exam in high school, and and part of it was giving a monologue. And so I thought, yeah, I know, Jerry and the Dog from Zoo Story.
Oh, you know it,
It's one of
yeah.
the great monologues. And this external examiner came in, and he was traveling around the entire area, going to schools, finding out how things are going. And he just said, okay, first of all, let's get this out of the way. No one does Jerry and the Dog. He said, this is the equivalent of someone who owns a guitar shop and someone coming in and playing Stairway to Heaven. It is not going to happen. Never.
What a snob.
I know, I lost my chance.
I can't believe that. It's I don't think
It's a great story.
It's a great monologue.
Yeah.
That guy had a rarefied taste.
I'm going to go to another story from when you were very young. But rather than have you tell it, we're going to show a clip from your 2017 documentary, Joan Didion, The Center Will Not Hold, and we can talk about the film as well. So if we can show the next clip, please.
I like that. I kind of had to fight with Netflix to keep that in the movie, because not because I wanted talk about my one ball, but people had an idea about Joan being this Mrs. Doom and Gloom and writing about Manson and murders and the center will not hold kind of grief-stricken essays. And I grew up with a woman who loved to laugh, and she was very, very funny. And I wanted people to see her laugh, and that's what she looks like when she laughs. And not many people had seen that before.
Yeah, I wanted it in for a number of reasons. One, because having seen that when it first came out, I read the whole of your memoir with that voice, your voice, telling me all the stories in this book, which was quite wonderful. But also not just seeing her, but seeing a really incredibly intimate glimpse into a relationship between two people, I think is just quite beautiful. And again, Joan is obviously one of the mainstays in the book.
And one more thing about that, though, is Joan is an essayist. She would write articles from a point of view that was always contrary to what mass media was saying. She saw the truth in something that it took people years to come around, and to her way of thinking. And in that, it's like a tiny just example of her not laughing at a little boy, and not going. She really looked like, I'm not with those guys. And it just shows her independent mind and her incredible point of view that was just searing.
So how much convincing did she require for you to get her to play a central role in this film?
Well, we had done a video to promote Blue Nights, which would be her last book. And we shot it like a short movie, very unlike the way they do most of these promotional videos for books. And we had a great time. And Joan at one time wanted to be an actress. And so we would get in the van with this young crew, and we go up to St. John's Cathedral, and we go to the Botanical Gardens, and we were running and gunning and shooting, and the crew just couldn't believe they would be having lunch with Joan Didion, and it was so much fun. So I decided to push my luck, and I said, listen, I know you've been asked 1 million times and turned everybody down to do a doc, but would you let me do a doc? Would you let me make this into a feature and continue? And she went, okay. And then I was off and running. But I also knew, oh my God, now I really have to do it. She has such a passionate fan base of readership, and everybody feels very possessive about. She writes from such a point of view that particularly women just think they're speaking to her. So I had to, with the material I chose, that I wanted to make sure I not only satisfied her readers and let them see sides of her they never would have seen had the movie not been directed by a relative of hers who she'd be so herself with. But I wanted the film to attract a younger and new audience, which it did. When she died, there was this image I'll never forget. Is I was in a subway going up to her memorial, and it was way up in Manhattan and at St. John's Cathedral, where her husband and daughter are entombed. And on the car was going to the same. It was open to the public, the memorial. Were about 40 girls, all like college and high school age, all holding her books, wearing black. And it was nice.
Just thinking about this film, and I watched it again recently before reading this book. Was the decision to write this made around the time that you made that film, of mining something deeper across the whole family?
Yeah, I think more subconsciously. When I dug into her life, it was a great practice run for my book in terms of dealing with her history and her ancestry, and going through her life and momentous moments in her life. It was, in film terms, it was like writing a biography, and that's what made me think. I guess that's what made me comfortable when I decided to write a biography of my own life, of my family. And I sort of just, I knew the structure, but I needed enough years to go by from their, since their passing, to really see the arc of their characters, and sort of see them, as children, and growing up and entering the business, and see their flaws. And my father had many struggles with sexuality and alcoholism, and there was a lot of family tension that many people didn't know about. But I knew the ending. I knew the ending of their arc. That they were extraordinary people who, particularly my parents, who overcame great tragedy and turned it into something positive that would help other people. And that was sort of my driving force in writing the book.
Have you ever kept diaries? Because it stunned me, the level of detail that you have in some of these sequences.
Well, I remember being told stories about my my great grandparents. My on my grandfather's side, on my mother's side, her grandparents and granduncles were just philanderers and rakes, and they got into all sorts of mischief. So those stories all stayed with me. And but I also find when I would tell stories about my relatives or about myself over dinner, I would notice that's a pretty great story, and I would just log them. And I had a nice, legal tablet of about 50 stories that I thought someday I'm going to do something with this, but not a diary.
So some of the stories are quite extraordinary, and I want to touch on a few before we see the next clip, partly because this next clip also deals with a similar story. Some of you might have read Mark Rosso's recent book, Everybody Thought We Were Crazy, about Dennis Hopper and Brooke Haywood in 1960s Los Angeles, in which yourself and your parents kind of figure throughout this book. And I'd always heard about Truman Capote's party in New York in '66, the black and white party, this being the great thing. And you mentioned in your book, but it was Rosso who first drew my attention to it, and basically saying, forget the Capote party. He was at your parents' party in '64. He danced the night away, and that was the party that everyone really should have been at. You were there. You came down to say goodnight.
Oh, no. At that one, we did not come down to say goodnight. No, because it was, as I said, my father he took his partying and his socializing very, very seriously. He literally took every piece of furniture out. This is for their 10th anniversary, of which there would not be an 11th. And he took out every piece of furniture in our house. He had set designers, build a set for each room, and build a dance floor, and hired an orchestra, the Peter Duchin, who you mentioned, Brooke Hayward, with Dennis Hopper. Brooke Hayward would eventually marry Peter Duchin. And it was such a big party and so much, it was kind of a legendary party and written about quite a bit. We were put in our pajamas with the overnight suitcases and our homework on the other hand, and checked into a hotel. So we didn't see that party. But, the coda to all this is Truman Capote was indeed there, and Dad seated him between, I think it was Tuesday Weld and Natalie Wood, because he knew he'd get them on the dance floor. And it was a roaring success. And also, Truman had just written In Cold Blood. And so he brought Thomas Dewey and his wife. He was the homicide detective that solved the In Cold Blood murder. They were not invited. And Dad had this, seating plan that he worked on, like it was algebra. And this threw off the entire seating. But anyway, he found a place for them. The evening was a huge success, and Truman Capote gave his ball, that black and white ball, which everyone is familiar with, and didn't invite my father. We don't know why, but that was Truman.
We're going to go to another party a couple of years later, but we're going to see it through the eyes of you as a debuting director. Your 1995 short, The Duke of Groove. In this sequence, your fictional mother on screen has asked you, played by Tobey Maguire, to come to a party on the promise that Janis Joplin is going to be there. And we're just about to arrive at the party, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in a moment. But can we show the clip, please? The real party.
Yes. Well, that was Tobey Maguire, for those who didn't recognize, and Uma Thurman and Kate Capshaw. And it's a short film that I wrote with Adam Brooks.
That was Oscar nominated.
And it's based on a real thing that happened, where John and Joan, my aunt and uncle, were giving a party for Tom Wolfe for a Kool-Aid acid test, a book party in Los Angeles. They lived in Franklin Canyon, on Franklin Street in Hollywood. And Janis Joplin was going to go to this party and come after her show at the Palladium. And Joan called my mom and said, "Why don't you bring Griffin? I know how much he loves Janis." So she brought me, and like that kid on the screen, I was like, I don't want Janis to find out I was brought here by my mother. Should we start to talk? And I was a little narcissist kid, and I was pretty sure she and I would have a real bond. So we were at this, but in real life, what happened, I was at this party, and like that kid, I was wandering around, everybody's smoking dope, and I'm waiting for Janis, and this bald guy with a thick German accent grabs my hand, and he pulls me down, and he said, "I have taken the acid. This place is filled with evil. You are the only good vibe here. You stay here, you don't leave." And I'm looking, and it's Hogan's Heroes. I don't know if they had it here. It was a big hit TV show. And I'm thinking, it's Colonel Klimp from Hogan's Heroes, and he's taking acid. And so that was interesting for about 5 minutes. And then I wanted to leave, and he wouldn't let me go. And then finally they played a Janis song, and I went, "Oh my God, she's here." And I just yanked my hand away. He screams at me, "Halt, halt." I think he said, "I will have you shot," but I could be exaggerating. And so the next day, John and Joan call my mom to, rehash the party, and then say, "Put Griffin on." So I tell them about Colonel Klink at the party, and I described, and they went, "Griffin, that wasn't Colonel Klink. That was Otto Preminger, the director."
And this is also the parties where you walk around the corner, you find your father sharing a spliff.
My there's a moment that's similar in the movie as well. But I passed my dad, and he's in the middle of toking it on a joint and handing it to Harrison Ford, who at that time was a carpenter, kind of a struggling actor. And yeah, he was there.
What's interesting about this, and the reason I wanted to show the gig scene, is that at one point we pass a character who's quite clearly Allen Ginsberg in conversation with someone in a white suit with a trilby hat. And it struck me what a lovely little shorthand for capturing a moment in time that you detail on many occasions at different parties in your book, about these two very distinct, very different generations suddenly grinding up against each other. And that must have been quite extraordinary to see this world sort of on its way out, the one coming in and the older world looking on in absolute horror at what it was facing.
Yes, and I was when I became a teenager, and then really got into movies. I became very aware of the transition of the people that were at my father's parties had probably already made the best work of their lives. They were the biggest movie stars and directors in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. But in the mid 60s, it was a fallow time in American cinema, the early 60s in particular. At this party was Dennis Hopper, and Dennis Hopper would be the man who would make Easy Rider and just make all these people dinosaurs and sort of irrelevant and be out of vogue. And then my aunt and uncle, also very social, would entertain the great filmmakers and actors and Warren Beatty and Scorsese and De Palma, and they would all be at their house in Malibu. So I was very aware of, I just saw the transition happen right before my eyes, of the old guard being taken over by the new guard.
And what's something I find quite interesting about a sense of association and friendship figures large throughout the whole of this book. And there's certain key friendships that you have, one of which really fascinated me was with Carrie Fisher.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk about your first encounter, which is just lovely. But I wondered if the longevity of that relationship was perhaps based on the idea that you both had parents that had association with this older world, but you were also part of a newer.
I think it's that we had parents who, were certainly in the business, but they were also not the farthest thing you could be from helicopter parents. We were both raised with what I call benign neglect. As long as we were alive by dinner at the dinner table, they didn't care where we were, and so we kind of grew up fast, and we were very precocious, and it did all sorts of adult things that one shouldn't do as a child. And, we hitchhiked around LA from the time I was 12 or 13. And so we kind of grew up fast. And she had a great, great wit. She was still the funniest person I've ever known. And so when we met, it was an immediate bond. We had the same sense of humor. And we both wanted to be, actors. And when I moved to New York, she just thought that was so romantic and so incredible. And so she came to New York. But her mother, Debbie Reynolds, I was living in a little hovel in the East Village that was like kind of a workshop for for thieves to steal apartments. I'd just been robbed somewhere. It was a real dump. And she wanted Carrie to have a roommate. She did not want her to live alone. She wanted to live in a doorman building that was safe. And she said, "You have to be her roommate." And so I ended up, we ended up rooming, and I paid the rent of what I paid in my dump. And we, had these great, New York adventures. I was a popcorn concessionaire at Radio City Music Hall, and I was a waiter, and everything but what I wanted to be was an actor. And she was going out for readings. And, in this section of the book, it's really about, how a friendship of two people who are, having the same dreams, and then one of them becomes overnight globally famous, and and it changed our friendship. It obviously changed her life enormously suddenly, and we in our apartment there was now, instead of the chorus people and the waiter friends of mine, there was like the Eagles and James Taylor and just every famous person you could see. And I felt, this isn't my time. I'm like counting my tips, while James Taylor's crying about Carly Simon. And I shouldn't be here, and people changed toward me, because I was her friend. I remember this doorman, this guy named Eddie, we would joke around all the time, and I, know whose kids are and all this stuff. And like overnight, he said, I came home from work, and he went, "Good evening, Mr. Fisher." I went, "Eddie, what the fuck is wrong with you?" But it all, and it was, it was heady. It was a heady experience. So, so I moved out, and I kind of had to get my own sea legs, and feel more, secure to enter that world again.
An interesting part of that is around this time you move into the role of a producer, first of all with Chilly Scenes of Winter, then the lovely John Sayles film Baby It's You, and later on a book you don't mention here but is one of my favorite films from the 1980s, Sidney Lumet's Running on Empty, and then Louis Mandoki's White Palace. And perhaps we can talk about producing and because obviously your directing career took off in the 90s as well after your debut. The attraction of both producing and directing to you?
Well, I was really struggling with trying to get a job as an actor. Reading difficulties. I just got nervous in auditions. But I could manage inexplicably to produce a movie for a major studio at the age of 23. With my two partners who were also struggling actors. And we optioned a book called Chilly Scenes of Winter, and we got a very, hot director at the time, Joan Silver, and United Artists financed this movie. And I literally went from, I remember going to a studio notes meeting, changing out of my paper hat and Radio City Music uniform, and being picked up by a limo and going to a first-class flight to LA, and having studio meetings. And I was able to give myself a small part in the movie. It got the biggest laugh. It got a huge laugh, and that started my acting career. I had to produce a movie to get an acting job.
The film that I've not mentioned as producer, that you also starred in, is Martin Scorsese's After Hours.
Mm-hmm.
Before we see a clip from it, I was stunned. Should I actually say who the other director you had on board, or should people find that out?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, we'll spoil it for you.
I mean, we kind of teased them. Well, it was Amy had read, my producing partner, Amy Robinson. She had read this script. And she, at the Sundance Lab in Utah, it was given to her by a director named Dusan Makaveyev, and his PA, his assistant rather, wrote it as a Columbia student, as a thesis to graduate. And the film is called Surrender Dorothy, soon to be called After Hours, and sent it to me, and we gave it to Marty, who Amy Robinson was in Mean Streets and knew him quite well, and we all had the same attorney. But he was off to do Last Temptation of Christ. He just made King of Comedy, which was financially a disaster, and he was sort of in director's jail, and he's in Morocco about to start this movie. So we thought, well, we're not going to see him for couple of years. So we go to see a Disney movie. I forget what the title was, but there was a short before it called Vincent by a director named Tim Burton, and it was animated. And the voice and the style, and so like, who is this guy? So we, found him, tracked him down. He was an animator at Disney, and he was, in a desk, among probably 50 other animators, and he's doing Mickey's toes while somebody's doing the hands, and it was all a part of a industry of animation. And we met him, and you could just tell immediately this guy was a genius. And he'd read the script, and he had little drawings, and Paul Hackett walking down hallways with bats in it, and went, wow, this guy's got it. And but we had a hard time getting it together. He'd never directed a feature, let alone a human being. And I was not in any way bankable, so it wasn't a very easy project to get money for. And we were dealing with this for almost a year. And then Scorsese gets fired. Well, not fired, they canceled Last Temptation of Christ right before they're about to start shooting. And he's coming back on, flying back from Casablanca to New York. He's got a stack of scripts of what I hope to do next. And After Hours was the first one he read. And he lands, and he calls our mutual attorney and says, I love this script. I want to do this. I don't know, boy, we got, whoa. So we meet with Tim, and he's now made like a little model. It was heartbreaking to see. And we're going, so listen, remember we told you about Marty and he was going to do it? And well, a funny thing, and he stops us and he goes, wait a minute, are you saying that Mr. Scorsese wants to make this movie? Well, yes. I mean, we haven't told him yes, but I respectfully withdraw from your project. I won't do anything to stand in the way of Scorsese making a picture. And we couldn't have worried less about him. We just knew he'd do fine. He gets hired to make Pee-wee's Big Adventure, which comes out and kicks After Hours' ass, by the way. So he turned out fine.
We're going to see a sequence now featuring, first of all, Linda Fiorentino, and then Rosanna Arquette, and obviously yourself. Again, the reason I love this, it comes back to this dark comedy. But what's great about this sequence, I think it shows not just your abilities as a comic with dialogue, but also physical comedy. Just the sort of rushing about that this character does throughout the whole of the film. So can we see this clip, please? What makes that scene is it, as well as your performances, is just the way that the camera moves slowly in on your face.
Yeah.
It must have been amazing working with Marty on the film.
It was indeed. Before we started, the months of pre-production, he sort of mentored me about, really taught me how to look at movies. He would always give me, this is someone you should know about. This is The Third Man. This is, Cat People. This is, they're all movies that might or might not, the Bresson and different directors that, and he'd go, what's great about this? And he'd point out a shot, and which I never would have noticed. And I never saw movies the same, it was, and then just seeing how he directed, there was such joy in what it was. And it became, this was, around the time I started to think, I think I could direct too. It's about loving what you do and being incredibly prepared. And then also being so prepared, you're willing to take on any idea, and you got to love actors. And, we would, he was quite humbled when he came back. He had made movies that were in the tens of millions of dollars. Our budget was less than $3 million. and so he couldn't hire any of the people he'd been working with for years. But on Baby It's You, we put together a crew. And Michael Ballhaus, we introduced him to, and Rita Ryak, and many of the crew went on to work for Marty for decades later. But it was also exciting to see. He would say he had to prove to the studios that he knew how to make a picture for a price, and he loved doing it because it brought him back. He went, God, this is just like when I made Mean Streets. I miss this so much. So it was, and bringing joy to your work as a director, and not be brooding, and making the other actors feel insecure because they think you don't like what they're doing. And actors are very sensitive, and they pick up on what the director is doing, and if how he's feeling, and will interpret it according to their own insecurities. But if they are with someone, being directed by someone who is so supportive and loves what they do, and off camera, I would just see out of the corner of my eye him just laughing, trying to hold in his laughter. It was great. It was. I learned a great deal.
You get that incredible sense of passion of how you feel about the film in the book. And also the film that you made before, Johnny Dangerously, with Michael Keaton, who you became a very close friend with. That was the first film I saw you in a movie.
Oh, really?
Johnny Dangerously. It became one of those obsessional films for a kid who just goes, I love this. I want to see it over and over again. So obviously when I read this, it was so surprising that we get to the second part of the book, and that is dominated by the murder of your sister, Dominique, and the trial happening as you're making Johnny Dangerously. It's a stupid question to say, was it tough writing this? But actually, do you know what I was thinking about? Many of you, I'm sure, have read Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking, about the death of her husband, your uncle. And it absolutely knocked me for six as someone talking about personal grief. But what this book does that's equally extraordinary is that it grapples with the idea of collective grief, collective rage at times, but also trying to find some kind of reconciliation, or at the very least, peace. Could you talk a little bit about reaching the second stage of this book and communicating this and finding a way to do that?
Yes. When I had a proposal for the book that went out to the publishers, and it was very sort of anecdotal and mostly humorous. And when Penguin purchased the book, my editor, a guy named John Burnham Schwartz, who's a wonderful novelist himself, suggested I write in sequence. And so it took me all the way back to the Mexican Revolution and the Great Famine, and all the way through, and my parents' childhood, which was pretty rough, and my being born, and I got to Dominique being born, and my mother bringing her home from the hospital. My mother had lost two girls before in childbirth. Each child had lived for a day, and so she finally had a little girl. And I remember her joy. I was quite young myself, and I'm going through sequence, and then Dominique becomes. She loved animals. She always picked up runaway strays and brought them home, and I'm going, okay, I know where this is going. And then she's going to become an actress, and her career, she started off, she was incredibly talented, and started to work right away. She said, I'm going to be an actress, and like a month later, she's on a soundstage in a starring role. And I go, okay, here we come. And she's, meets this guy. She falls in love with this man who's a sous chef in a very popular restaurant at the time in Los Angeles. And my sister was a foodie, and so I guess they had that in common. And then I go, okay, here it comes. I see the headlights of now the book is going to change. My feelings are going to change. I'm going to be internally changed in the course of writing this. It didn't stop me. I didn't have writer's block. I just had the same compulsion as I did in the beginning. But I knew as I got into it and the homicide detective, I get to the point where the homicide detective comes to my mother's house at 4 a.m. to say that her daughter is on life support from being strangled by this guy. I realized this is part 2. Because this was the moment by which our family changed forever. And the book would be different. The tone would be different. So I just wanted to get it right. I figured by this point the reader would know the narrator, so I wouldn't have to ever say anything expositional. I could just write the horror that took place of not only the murder but the trial that took place afterwards. Dominique was a victim of domestic violence, and the defense for the killer took the tactic of, which is very common, particularly among women, victims of violence, of rape and murder, of blaming the victim. And they dragged her reputation to the mud. And I just, that's where the rage comes in on all of us. We were all in a period of madness. I mean, Joan actually would say magical thinking, but it was an alternate reality of how we saw things. We were just burning with rage. But at the same time, that was true all the way through in the first part of the book. We also had an incredibly good sense of humor that saved us. Sometimes we'd be crying with laughter. At the worst moments of our lives, we would just start, somebody would say something funny and would just be such a relief, and all this time I'm doing a movie, a really fun but silly fucking movie. And I'm playing it's set in the 30s, and I'm playing a crime fighter, Tommy Dunne crime fighter. And it was like a Mickey Rooney kind of a part. But I would go to that set on the days I was not in the trial, in the courtroom. And the crew and the actors were, it moves me to this day how, it was in the front page of the paper and the news. It was a constant thing. They knew what was going on. And nobody talked to me about it. They would just let me play. They would let me forget. But my parents and my brother didn't have that escape. They would go home after court and sit with TV trays, and they'd watch the news of the horror that took place in that courtroom. Every day was just one worse day after another. This guy had a history of violence against women that none of us, Dominique included, were aware of. And they found a woman that was a previous girlfriend of his. He'd put in the hospital twice with knocking her eye socket out and her jaw, and just horrible things he did to her. And she was called to testify, and it was terrifying for her to do this in front of the killer in this courtroom. The judge would not allow the jury to see this. The judge said it was be prejudicial, and the jury was dismissed, and they missed this horrific testimony from this woman bravely recounting what happened to her, and they missed the killer in a rage that that she was up there, get up out of his seat in a kind of like, I don't need this shit, get out and be wrestled to the ground by bailiffs and shoved back in his seat, and hear the judge say, his name is Sweeney, John Sweeney. That's the only time I'll say his name. And he said, that's okay, Mr. Sweeney. I know how difficult this is for you. We had days like that. but I had so I had a very strange, you know, I don't know, maybe I'm schizophrenic or something. I'd be on the set and I wouldn't think about it. I would just be, everybody was so funny. And we just played. We're incredibly silly.
But what ultimately comes through for me in that second part, I'm sure everyone has sort of complex relations with their parents. I've always had kind of an interesting relationship with my father, and it struck me that in this journey that you take in this book of wondering who your father was, and it's someone from a distance when he's younger, of becoming this person that I first knew, the big Vanity Fair reporter writing on all the big crime stories, which began by his writing on Dominique's her murder and the subsequent trial. You somehow so skillfully bring your relationship with him into sharp focus. And that sense of reconciliation, I think, is something I find quite extraordinary in this book, of he's now passed and how you feel towards him.
Yeah. Well, I have in the epigraph at the beginning of the book, it's a line of his that he told me once when I was, you know, upset at something he did that bothered me. And he said, "What can I tell you, kiddo? I'm a work in progress." And he was, you know, in his 50s when he said that. And the kind of man that he was when I was a kid, who was, you know, kind of fussy and, you know, cared so much about, you know, objects and fame and all that sort of thing. And also wasn't particularly a masculine guy. And all my friends' fathers, I went to a school where everybody's parents were in the business. My two best friends' fathers played, one was Jack Palance, his father was Jack Palance, who, you know, was a gunslinger in Shane. And the other was Howard Keel, who played lumberjacks. And they were big, tough guys. And you know, they would, the sons, Gunnar and Cody were their names. My name was Griffin. How about those four names? And they go, you know, our dad could lick your dad with one hand tied behind. And I said, my dad will kick both your dad's ass just as soon as he gets out of prison. You went, what's he in for? What? He robbed a bank. And this, the principal called our house and spoke to my dad. And, oh, you're out of prison. And my dad knew I was like embarrassed of him. And you know what I didn't know, which I didn't know until many, many years later, that, you know, when the Saving Private Ryan came out, by this time, you know, he was a very famous crime reporter for Vanity Fair, their star journalist, and he was getting awards and having been lost everything and fought his way back and found his true purpose in life. He really loved being famous. He loved being, and every time somebody recognized him, you know, he was once called me from the Chateau Marmont in the hotel, and he left this on my voicemail. He goes, "You're not going to believe who knows me. I saw him in the elevator. Bono, the Irish guy, Bono knows who I am." And so every small accomplishment, he would tell me. When Saving Private Ryan comes out, he calls me up and he says, "Griffin, can you come over here?" And he'd just been diagnosed with prostate cancer. So I thought, I was quite concerned by the tone in his voice. And I go over there and he said, "I saw Private Ryan." And this is what I rushed up downtown for. I go, "Okay." And he goes, "You know, I was in the war." And somehow I blanked that out, or I knew that, or I didn't. I just couldn't even picture my father in a uniform. And I knew a lot about the war. I was like, you know, but I never thought about him being in the war. And he tells me the story of him and another guy in his unit who was also, his masculinity was in question. And the company mocked them, horrendously, calling them the Gold Dust Twins and making swish fey motions to them all the time. They were one night in the Ardennes Forest in the Battle of the Bulge, were on observation, on point at observation, and the platoon was behind them, and they were. The order was given to retreat, but my father and the other guy, whose name was Hank, they heard two American soldiers, not from their platoon, very wounded behind enemy lines. And without a word between them, they just went and they got those guys, and they carried those two guys on their backs all night long. And they found an ambulance that was loading up, and they said, "We don't have any room." And my dad flipped out. "You get this fucking, fuck you." And they go, okay. And they get him in. And as the soldier is being loaded in, he never said a word, the wounded soldier. He just takes my father's hands and squeezes it. So he tells me this story, and he goes, and he reaches in his pocket, and he pulls out a medal. He goes, I got a bronze medal. And he goes, I can't tell you how terrified I was. I was so fucking scared. But I did that. I can't believe I did that. And he'd never thought about it, until he saw that movie. It just brought it all back. And I thought, how incredible, with all the things that he, kind of brags proudly about. That's one thing he never mentioned, That's how deep that terror and that trauma was. But also, when it's something really important, that's not what you talk about. Yeah. That's not your bragging rights. Yes, I had a small part in The Fan. It was a movie with Lauren Bacall. It was about a stalker, a serial killer who was stalking Lauren Bacall, who was a Broadway star. And her assistant was played by Maureen Stapleton, who would eventually play my mother in Johnny Dangerously. And Hector Alexander was playing the homicide detective. And he keeps going through the movies trying to find the killer. If we only knew what he looked like, if we only knew. And then I'm about to shoot my first scene, my first movie, in a little scene in New York. And it's the killer, Michael Biehn, says, can you give this to Lauren Bacall character? And I said to the director, I went, now you're going to have to add the scene with me and Hector, because I know what the killer looks like. He goes, don't be a smart ass, just do the thing. So in the first take, I was a smart ass, and I said, oh, a letter from the killer arrived. And he cut, and so I said the line correctly. And then the previews come out, and apparently in all the cards they went, why didn't anybody talk to that boy? That's what I remember most from that movie. I'm in a period of great hope. There was a period, from really from the night of the attack and the years that followed. And then my mother was diagnosed with MS, and she was and her health, and there were other things that happened where we would kind of question if we were possibly cursed, and it just felt like you didn't want to get out of bed. What the fuck is going to happen now? And it was different. I didn't know anyone else, other families that were having this sort of onslaught of things going on. And I remember, somebody saying kind of glibly to me, hey, you're kind of like the Kennedys. And I was really, offended by that. I married the mother of my daughter when when we married quite early in our relationship, and kind of an unexpected pregnancy, but we were very, very happy together. And her life in Colorado, the worst thing that had ever happened in her family was when their great aunt Nini died at the age of 94. And not one person had been in rehab, in jail, in a mental institution, had been murdered, and went, I want those genes for my kid. And I don't know that it works like that, but I thought like that. But I have been, I don't think about that kind of stuff anymore. I'm sort of just, I'm filled with hope, and I just looked at it as at that period of my family's life as sort of a dark season, and a season of a certain kind of madness that I think we all pulled through, not by chance, but aggressively trying to pull through, and making something horrible better for other people, and with my mother's activism and my father's writing, and I've become political in gun violence prevention. I just we learned from it, and we grew from it. I had an innate understanding of that character, and we shot, like all movies, out of sequence, and which was particularly tricky because you had to know exactly where you were emotionally, when you entered the room, of exactly what happened, and I was buffeted by events all the way through that night. I was helped by having the wardrobe department make 15 different tan suits. And each suit, if I saw that, oh, there's the rip, and I know where the dirt came from. Oh, that's the night, that's when it rained. And each suit brought me right back to where I knew exactly where I was by putting on the suit. That was really helpful. So we didn't, I thought that would be the biggest challenge, but actually it just sort of flowed.
The Friday Afternoon Club is now available even to buy. There are copies outside in the BFI bookshop and up in the Blue Room. And of course, Griffin will be up there signing copies of the book. Thank you to Grove Press and to the BFI for helping to organise this evening. But most of all, can you please join me in thanking Griffin Dunne?
Thank you.
Thank you.